In this series of videos, we're going to look at imperialism in the 19th century, which you might appropriately call an age of imperialism. You look at the map and all the countries in color were part of empire. So really a huge portion of the world was under new imperial control in the 19th century. And first we want to look at motives for imperialism and some of the factors that enable powers to build these empires. So the motives that we'll talk about, I've got displayed here. You can see the 19th century imperialism rooted in the rise of industrialization and industrialism from the Industrial Revolution, in a new philosophy is called social Darwinism, in a desire to explore and an effort to spread Christianity, and in the newfound nationalism which we saw in the prior century and in the 19th century itself. So when we think about industrialism, the reason that countries were wanting to build colonies was very similar to the previous age of imperialism we saw during the 16th and 17th centuries, when we saw the colonization of the Americas. Colonies had two main purposes. They were a market for goods, and they're a source of raw materials. So what makes this different? It's mostly the scale. With the Industrial Revolution, countries are really increasing how much things they're producing. The need to expand markets and sell more and to expand more is higher. And the kinds and amounts of goods they need has really scaled up. So as much as the economic systems in previous centuries, like mercantilism, were important in building those previous colonies, the economic need to produce and sell goods drove imperialism in the 19th century. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of the Species. It's probably something you heard before. To sum it up, basically, Darwin's argument was that the reason that there are so many different species is rooted in natural selection. Some animals and some species are better adapted to the environment. Those are most likely to pass their genes on to their children, and those traits will continue on, and those that are not as well adapted, those traits will die off. When he published this, it was important scientific work, but also people started to look at this and say, hey, if you could apply this to animals, why not also to people? And by people, what some people meant was different races. They saw different races and national groups of people as almost like different species. And this idea became known as social Darwinism. Basically, this idea that some people and some lifestyles are better suited and adapted to the world and survival than other people and civilizations and lifestyles. This could take a few kind of different turns. First of all, we should point out that this is not really scientific. This is at best pseudoscience. But it gave sort of good scientific veneer to imperialists. But also, this is sort of a scientific apology for racism. This is a diagram from this age of social Darwinism. It tried to sort of compare, Europeans, who are supposed to be more evolved, air quotes here, than other races. You could look at people making arguments at the time, basically said that what makes us more civilized and better adapted? Well, we wear pants. We had the Industrial Revolution. We have Christianity. Mostly it was Europeans and Westerners promoting their civilization above other civilizations and trying to make the argument that made them scientifically better somehow. How that actually played out in imperialism took a couple different forms. On the one, I guess you could argue more sort of positive-ish side, was this idea that it was the job of civilized, again air quotes, countries to bring their civilization to other people. You see that this political cartoon. The United States, as we'll talk about later, had an era of imperialism where they took over lots of different territories, and they mostly did under the guise of bringing democracy and modernization to those places. This took a form of understanding of imperialism called paternalism. The word paternalism comes from that Latin root pater, which means father, and basically the idea of paternalism is that imperial colonizers treated their colonized and conquered people like children. They basically said, we're here to teach you and provide you industry and bring you out of this depth and darkness in which you live. Therefore, you're not ready for democracy yet. So we'll give you democracy maybe later, but right now you're going to be part of our colony. That was sort of an approach you saw a lot of imperialists take. On the other hand, you could take this more sort of, you could argue, evolutionary approach. The idea that there's only so much resources out there, they're a finite amount, and therefore the most evolved people have to take those resources from the less evolved people. And if you did that, it was justified because it's scientific, it's evolution. So you saw some countries saying, well, we're superior, therefore we need to take this stuff from the inferior people. Another motive for imperialism in the 19th century was exploration. Again, this is similar to the previous age of imperialism. Here we talk about exploration, we're mostly talking about Africa. Africa was the one continent that Europeans really hadn't explored because they couldn't get to the interior. When they did, they tended to die of malaria or other diseases. We'll talk about some of the factors that enabled them to do that. But there was this push to really kind of explore what they consider the dark continent, sort of exemplified by this guy, David Livingstone, who went out to find the source of the Nile, and he disappeared for years, and an American journalist came out and eventually found him. And that got published and really drove people to say, well, what's out there? What can we rediscover or discover for the first time now that we're industrialized and modern? Also, like the previous age of imperialism, you have the drive for missionary work, the spread of Christianity. In previous centuries, mostly we were talking about the Catholic Church. The Spaniards, the Jesuits, the Portuguese trying to spread Catholicism. Here you do see some of that, but really there's more of a drive of Protestantism, of different churches trying to go out and recruit more people, try to save them from their savage and heathen ways, quote unquote. So obviously some of this is rooted in their genuine belief, but also you can connect it back to that social Darwinism, this idea that other religions were inferior, and it was the job of these white civilized Westerners to bring the right religion to everybody else. And finally, we have this idea of nationalism. Now, we saw the 19th century really was an age of nationalism. But as some of these nations start building their own empires, their neighbors will start to see them as rivals. You see competition between different Western nations in trying to carve out empires among different parts of the world. This political cartoon, for example, shows Germany, Britain, Russia, France, and Japan carving out parts of China for themselves, trying to take the best pieces. And so this competition between different nations also drives nationalism. If one country has an empire or a colony, then its neighbor is going to want the same thing. All right, so everything that's what Europeans wanted. How did they actually get that? Because most of these desires aren't new. Well, we have a lot of changes in the late 18th and into the 19th century that enable Europeans to, and other Western nations, to expand. One is the growth of new technology. Think of the Industrial Revolution and all the new technologies that were invented. Some of these could be used offensively. For example, pictured here is a Maxim gun. The Maxim gun was the first machine gun. And while you could debate whether technology was an advantage for Europeans in the previous age of imperialism, here it's really almost unquestionable. When you've got people who are still using technology from previous centuries, it just can't stand up to a machine gun. You also have new other scientific discoveries like quinine. Quinine is a drug that can treat the symptoms of malaria. The biggest hurdle for Europeans to get into Africa was that they frequently contracted malaria and died. With the discovery of quinine, a drug that can treat malaria, now suddenly Africa becomes more available for Europeans to explore, and that will be a target for imperialists. And finally, you have better communication and transportation technology. Specifically, we're talking about the railroad and the telegraph. If you're trying to build an empire, you need to be able to really have resources and infrastructure to move goods and communication quickly. And the ability of industrialized nations to build this kind of infrastructure in newly conquered places really kind of gave them a leg up in organizing and pushing back against people they wanted to conquer. And we'll see how they conquered in some of the later videos.